Good morning. You know, I was watching you guys come in. You're all smiling. What's happened? Must be the sunshine, the snow on the mountains. See the snow on the mountains? That's pretty cool, isn't it? Well, we're so glad you're here. Welcome, welcome to the Dorothy Marie Lowry Distinguished Guest Lectureship Series. Today we have a very special event for you all, and we're really looking forward to it. I just want to, first of all, encourage those with cell phones. Could you go down, reach down right now and turn them off, or just turn them to silent? We've had a problem the last few weeks with people's cell phones going off, and that's obviously not helpful for the speaker, but people around you really want to listen, and it's hard. So thank you so much for that. I just want you to know I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to see all these faces. Next week we have someone coming representing Camp Pendleton. Actually, the head of Camp, the colonel over Camp Pendleton is going to come talk about Camp Pendleton's impact on California and the world. And he's bringing some people with him. It's going to be a great time, so you're not going to want to miss that. All right, let me introduce Dr. Sam Erman to you all. Sam Erman is an associate professor of law at the USC Gould School of Law. He has just released his first book with Cambridge University Press, Almost Citizens, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Constitution and Empire. There, he lays out the tragic story of how the United States denied Puerto Ricans full citizenship following annexation of the island in 1898. As America became an overseas empire, a handful of remarkable Puerto Ricans debated with U.S. legislators, presidents, judges, and others over who was a citizen and what citizenship meant. The struggle caused a fundamental shift in constitutional jurisprudence away from the post-Civil War regime of citizenship, rights, and statehood, and toward doctrines that accommodated racist imperial governance. Dr. Erman's gripping account shows how, in the wake of the Spanish-American War, administrators, lawmakers, and presidents, together with judges, deployed creativity and ambiguity to transform constitutional law and interpretation over a quarter century of debate and litigation. A scholar of law of history, Erman has published in leading legal and historical journals, including the Michigan Law Review, the California Law Review, the Southern California Law Review, the Michigan Law Review, and the Journal of American Ethnic History. It's a lot. He teaches and mentors on constitutional law and legal history to undergraduates, law students, and graduate students. Prior to joining USC, he worked at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, Harvard Law School, and as a law clerk to Justices John Paul Stevens and Anthony Kennedy, and to Judge Merrick Garland. He earned his JD and PhD from the University of Michigan and his AB from Harvard University. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Sam Erman. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for those kind words. It always makes you happy when someone says your book is gripping. So my plan today is to tell you about the book and then use that to talk a little bit about the modern Supreme Court. And so the theory here is I'm going to show you what I learned and then try to work through how what I learned doing this book changes how I think about pending cases or shifts in Supreme Court personnel. So it used to be the case that I had to explain what Puerto Rico is when I gave talks. And that's no longer true. Bad things have happened in Puerto Rico that have made its plight front and center. So one is they're in the middle of this debt crisis, and they owe something like $100 billion, which is about $100,000 per household on the island, which is to say that's about 5 times as much as each household makes on the island in a given year, which means it's entirely unpayable, and if it was a state, you would have expected a forceful federal response by now, because the state representatives and senators would have been able to horse trade in order to get bailed out. And instead, what you're looking for is a lost generation of economic growth on the island. We also know that there was a large hurricane in Puerto Rico. It knocked out the electricity grid. It took over a year for the lights to come back on reliably throughout the island. And the federal response, again, differed because Puerto Rico wasn't a state. As compared to states that have emergencies, the response in Puerto Rico by the federal government was much slower and more inadequate. And so my book is about how did we get here? Specifically, how did colonialism of the type that is practiced in Puerto Rico come to be constitutionally acceptable within the United States? To put it in slightly more hyperbolic terms, how did the longest-running continuous democracy in the world end up holding the globe's oldest colony? And so, as many of you know, the United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898 as part of the war between the United States and Spain that occurred in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. And after the war, the United States annexed Puerto Rico in 1899. And my book talks about what followed. It makes three interrelated arguments. So the first one is that there's a big change between 1898 and 1925. From the end of the Civil War, more or less, until the annexation of Puerto Rico, more or less, there was a general consensus that the Constitution said that all Americans were citizens unless they were American Indians, that all lands were current or future states with the one exception of the capital, and that the Constitution applied in full at least as far as U.S. borders extended. And so what happens is we end up with a big shift away from each of those three, so that we create a new category of non-citizen Americans. We create places that don't have full constitutional rights, and these places are not thought to be destined for statehood. The second argument I make has to do with this slide, which is I argue that it's not just the courts that changed the meaning of the Constitution. In fact, the Constitution was changed by a wide variety of actors. Bureaucrats in the federal agencies innovated, Congress, the president, fancy lawyers and legal academics, and even more modestly situated private individuals who brought claims, all helped to drive the process of constitutional change. And finally, I argue that this happened through a piecemeal and cooperative project. So this was, maybe I'll go back to this slide for this little part. So the idea here is that shifting constitutional meaning requires taking creative risks. You have to build something new, and you have to put it in place as an enduring rule without knowing how the rule will play out in the real world. And so what you end up with is you have this sort of back and forth between different parts of the government where each part is signaling to each other part. So the courts say, maybe we can go easy on this part of the Constitution, but we'd really like to keep this part the way it is. And the War Department says, well, we really need this to make the colonies run well. And then legal academics say, well, that doesn't make much coherent sense, but here's a way to frame it. And so over a period of about a quarter century, there's lots of tentative moves that slowly add up to big changes. And the way this works for the courts is that they have lots of ways of signaling without binding themselves. So they might have a case where there's no majority. So they're trying out different ideas, but none is law. Or they write a really ambiguous opinion, and it's not clear what it means. Or they rule very narrowly and only settle one small thing, but then talk about other stuff. And these are different ways the court says, here's an idea we might try out, or here's something you might want to steer away from. And one thing I discovered as I did this, so this was the change I described earlier, was that there was this strong undertow of race and racism around constitutional change in the early 20th century. So often when people talked about how the law should change or what the law should be, they mixed it together with racial imagery in which the United States might appear as a father or a husband, and Puerto Rico might appear as a wife or a lover or a child. So here we have, right, the female and childlike Puerto Rico. That's a pretty common depiction. And you'll notice that other places sometimes are portrayed as darker than Puerto Rico or as more uncivilized than Puerto Rico. But Puerto Rico is still not, right, the adult male head of the classroom or head of the household. And this is going on in the context of the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So well into the 20th century, fights over how the Civil War would be remembered and what its legal legacy would be were intertwined with questions of whether the United States would become an empire and what the rules for that empire would be. To put it differently, the Reconstruction past and the imperial future were often thought to be one and the same problem. And so here, part of what, right, I like this comic from the New York Times because you can see we have the United States struggling with what to do, and it's already decided we're going to just put down African Americans. So this says Negro, and that baby's on the floor. And Uncle Sam doesn't look like he's doing a really good job with his new colonies, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And you get the sense maybe some of them are going to get dropped too, right? Like you can see people are thinking of these as similar and related problems. The aftermath of the Civil War provided both Democrats and Republicans reasons to be wary of the United States annexing new places and holding them as colonies. So Republicans were the party of emancipation. They had given meaning to Reconstruction by sanctifying the Reconstruction Constitution, the new amendments that had brought about citizenship for a broader set of people and fuller rights. National Republicans by 1898 weren't really fighting for black voting rights anymore, but they were formally committed to them. And formal commitment to full voting rights, regardless of race, is at odds with most versions of imperialism. For Democrats, the problem with Reconstruction was that they thought of it as a period of federal tyranny and black misrule. So they celebrated the overthrow of Reconstruction, which had brought Democrats to power throughout the former Confederacy. And so their party is essentially the party of white supremacy during this period. And they abhor the prospect of statehood, citizenship, and rights for non-whites, which is most of the people who live in the annexed places. Also, Democrats had taken control of the southern state governments, but their hold on them was still tenuous in 1898. So the idea of a federal government powerful enough to run colonies scared them. What if that imperial federal government turned its sights back on the South? At the same time, Democrats and Republicans had good reasons to want to reconcile their views to empire. So those reasons were rooted in racisms that were quite ingrained. It was very hard for top political leaders or most white Americans to see a world structured other than by race. Increasingly, Republican leaders thought Reconstruction had failed, and the lesson was racially inferior people cannot be trusted with self-government. So they began to favor imperial governance outside the strictures of the Reconstruction Constitution. For Democrats, every year in power meant a tighter hold. they became less and less worried that the federal government might leverage them out of power in the South. That allowed their white supremacy to become their major concern, and white supremacy and imperialism did fit together fairly well. Okay, so my method is I study citizenship, and what I try to do is use citizenship as a middle ground to try to see lots of different people sort of fighting and maneuvering. And I think citizenship is a good place to look because it's both a formal legal category that people care, that matters, right? It determines rights and membership, but it's also a popular category. When people say, I don't want to be a second-class citizen, they're not always reaching for some legal rule. They're often just talking about some sense that citizenship should have certain social meaning and should bring about certain belonging. Let's see if I can fix that. In, out. Okay. It's something people argue about, where you can see the fairly modestly situated all the way up to presidents engaging on it in a common language. And the other thing I do in the book is I take a narrative approach. So I try to tell the story of constitutional change through 4 remarkable Puerto Ricans who sought citizenship from federal officials, and so I can trace them into the federal government and figure out who in the federal government is doing the constitutional work. So this book tells the story of almost citizens, and that is the people of Puerto Rico, who were deemed neither citizens nor aliens for many years, and who lived in a place that was judged neither foreign nor domestic. And the story begins at the very end of the 19th century, when the United States annexes Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, and American Samoa. And this brings millions of people of African, Asian, Pacific Islander, and indigenous descent into U.S. sovereignty. The question this raised was, would these people become citizens, and what would this citizenship mean? So it was perfectly possible to imagine citizens who would not have full rights. Women, African Americans, Chinese Americans, Mexican Americans, children were all familiar with this category. So it was, right, you could get a robust citizenship, a thin citizenship, or something other than citizenship. And to tell this story, it's helpful to go all the way back to the end of the Civil War briefly. So the Civil War ends in 1865. This slavery is in tatters. The South is in ruins. The North, and especially the Republican Party, are dominant for the moment. And the end of slavery, right, emancipation, is going to revolutionize the United States. It's going to be a major change, and the question of how that change will play out is initially unclear. So it could be that you would work very hard to ensure that former slaves would in all ways be equal to whites, and it could be that you would free former slaves and do nothing else and call it a day. And so what Republicans do is they try to work a far-reaching change, but they're only really willing to use law as their tool. And so they do this experiment in law where they enact new amendments to the Constitution that are designed to guarantee equality. And I'm going to focus us on the aspects relevant to empire. So first, the 13th Amendment bars slavery, and then the 14th Amendment does 2 things. It first says that anyone born in the United States gets to be a citizen, and it says that that citizenship is going to bring privileges and immunities. And if you look at pre-Civil War precedents, there's good reasons to think those privileges and immunities will be fairly wide-ranging. And the 15th Amendment seems to reinforce this. It guarantees no racism in voting, and so the thought is voting is now perhaps part of the bundle of rights that former slaves are going to be able to take up. this all happens against the backdrop of the Dred Scott case. So as many of you will know, Dred Scott versus Sanford is this infamous Supreme Court case from 1857, right before the Civil War, where the Supreme Court said both that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress could not bar slavery in the territories. So the 13th Amendment overturns the no slavery in the territory, or no barring slavery in the territories, and the 14th Amendment overturns no citizenship for African Americans. But Dred Scott also included language that suggested that all U.S. places eventually had to be states. And so we also have this notion that anytime you annex a place, it has to eventually become a state. The people in that place, at least those born there, will be citizens, and they're going to get a broad array of rights. And so the result was the United States stopped annexing places. So in place, they didn't stop expanding, but in place after place, the United States stopped short of extending its sovereignty. So where sovereignty already was extended, right, in the U.S. West, there were Indian wars, they subdued tribes that were still hostile to the United States or that had any autonomy, and they pushed out to fully control those lands. No need to extend borders, though. Formally, the borders already went all the way west. They had opportunities to annex lots of other places, and in each case, they decided instead to exercise some other form of control. So in East Asia, we see they have treaty ports where if you're an American and you're brought into court, you get tried by American law, by American officials, but there's no annexation. In American Samoa, the United States gets into this really awkward co-management agreement with Great Britain and Germany because it doesn't want to divide up the Samoan Islands and sort of each annex them separately. Hawaii and the Dominican Republic get involved in really nice treaty arrangements with the United States, ones that are very favorable to the United States. There had been pushes to annex both of those. Treaties were drawn up more than once, but those never come through. There's also an attempt to annex the Virgin Islands. That fails. And then the United States asserts its ability to keep everybody else out of Venezuela, so it basically threatens to go to war with England if England meddles there. And the English say, I mean, it's fine if you want to run Venezuela, but you should really annex it. And the United States is basically says, no, we're gonna protect it and we're gonna boss it around, but we're not gonna annex it. So this then leads to the Spanish-American War. And here we have a little bit of a problem for Puerto Rico, which is that, or for the United States, I should say, which is up until now, they've always not annexed places. But now they've taken over an island that they think is valuable, and it's clear that the powers that be do want to annex Puerto Rico. And so U.S. military commanders show up thinking we're going to own this island, but also thinking the Reconstruction Constitution still applies. And so what these military commanders do is they articulate to Puerto Ricans, you should cooperate with us. You should help us take over because you're going to be American citizens with full American rights, and Puerto Rico will eventually be an American state. And they don't get a lot of pushback from Washington on this in, say, August, when they're first kind of taking over control of the country. But then eventually, the Philippines gets added to the list of places that the United States will annex. So the Philippines was a Spanish colony. The United States had defeated the Spanish fleet in the Bay of Manila. And then when the war ended, the protocol ending it had said the United States was going to get Guam, that it was going to get Puerto Rico, and that the Philippines was going to be left for later. And when it comes time for negotiation, President William McKinley eventually decides, you know what, we really should take the whole Philippines. All the other options aren't very good. And having decided that, the whole landscape, the whole political landscape shifts, really quickly. So what happens is political officials in Congress suddenly become very concerned that Filipinos are going to join the United States in large numbers. There's about 8 million people in the Philippines. Puerto Rico is the largest of the other annexed places in terms of population. It has barely 1 million. Puerto Ricans are thought to be like predominantly Spanish, with maybe a large minority of mixed Spanish-African descent. And Spaniards in this period are thought to be somewhat worse than Anglo-Saxons, but they are what we might call a darker shade of pale. So people think we can take Spaniards. There's not that many. We can work with that. The Philippines, though, are thought to be more racially degraded and more numerous, and so you suddenly hear this sort of hysterical language that they are utterly alien, racially inferior, a mix of Malays, Tagals, Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, Negritos, and various more or less barbarous tribes. And so what you get is a Senate called upon to ratify a treaty of annexation that is going to bring in a group of people that almost everyone in the Senate agrees cannot be citizens, should not get full rights, and come from a place that should never be a state. So the debate centered on whether or not the United States could run the Philippines as a colony. That's what President McKinley's Republican Party argued. Or whether the Philippines should not be annexed because the Constitution would require citizenship rights and statehood were the Philippines to be annexed. And here, Democrats, they're white supremacists, but they don't like the idea of an entirely weak Constitution because they understand the Constitution to be a bulwark for states' rights against federal overreach. So they're worried that if you start interpreting the Constitution to let the federal government run the Philippines however it wants, that could easily then become a power that could be used against them. What ends up happening is, well, I will say before that, what the Democrats do is they rather gleefully point out to the Republicans that the Republicans had been the party of Reconstruction and black voting rights, and now they're the ones pushing for like racist federal governance. And so they spend a lot of time sort of noting Republican hypocrisy. The solution is a compromise. So they ratify the treaty, and then they claim that it doesn't mean what it says. So what they say is, the treaty says Spain cedes this to the United States, and they say, sure, we'll ratify that. Spain, go ahead and cede away, but we're not saying that we're incorporating Filipinos or the Philippines. And the idea seems to be that a second step is required after someone attempts to cede to you, whereby you then accept the cession. So what happens at this stage is McKinley hires this guy, Elihu Root, to be the Secretary of War. And McKinley realizes a fight is coming over the Constitution. So Root has no military experience, but he's a very good lawyer. And the War Department is running Puerto Rico and the Philippines in this period. And so what McKinley's thinking is, maybe if I get a really good lawyer as Secretary of War, he can lay out a constitutional theory that will gain traction in the courts, both because it'll be like their kind of person laying out their kind of theory and their kind of language, and because he'll be in charge of the War Department, and they'll be worried if they don't do what he says, the whole empire will now collapse. And Root wrote a very long, very smart analysis of sort of why empire is okay, but the bottom line was really simple. He argued anything goes. So he cited cases involving African Americans, women, Chinese, Mormons, Americans overseas, aliens, other disfavored groups and places, And he said, if you look at these, the United States has mistreated all of these groups and it's been fine. So the idea that self-government, citizenship, statehood are necessary doesn't make any sense. They can all be withheld. So this is not good news for Puerto Rico, in part because Puerto Rico had the bad luck to come in on the same treaty as the Philippines. And Republicans light on this idea that the Supreme Court might tell us we have to be nice in some ways to peoples we've fully annexed. So why don't we pass legislation for Puerto Rico, and then if the Supreme Court says Puerto Ricans are citizens or whatever, we can still de-annex the Philippines before the Supreme Court gets a bite at that apple. And so initially they had thought they would pass they'd pass legislation making Puerto Rican citizens and giving them free trade, and instead they go back and they strip out everything nice from the bill. So they pass a law that basically gives Puerto Rico only a symbolic say in its own governance. They impose a very small tariff on trade because they want to create a test case about whether or not there has to be free trade. And that's important because the Constitution says that all duties shall be uniform throughout the United States. So what they want to do by putting in this very small tariff is to test whether Puerto Rico is part of the United States. If it's not part of the United States, then it can have a duty unique to it. If it is part of the United States, it'll violate uniformity. And this is a great test case because it involves no sympathetic plaintiffs. Nobody's rights are really involved. This is just transferring a little bit of money. And so they think if we're ever going to win before the Supreme Court, this is the kind of case we want. They had originally said Puerto Ricans would be U.S. citizens. Now they withhold that. They had originally said Puerto Ricans would get a territorial delegate like all prior territories. Now instead they rename the position a resident commissioner and tell the resident commissioner to register with the Secretary of State the same way a foreign ambassador would. Democrats feel, let's see, what do I have here? We'll come back to that in a sec. Democrats are still worried here. So they think, look, what you're doing by setting up this test case is you're setting up a test case to argue that federal power is much bigger than we thought. And so Democrats say things like, let me get the quote right, no such dangerous and absolute power was ever before lodged in an irresponsible carpetbag government. But it passes because Democrats are still in the minority in Congress and there's a Republican in the White House. And then the Supreme Court test case that's envisioned does come along. So there's a series of disputes that bubble up in 1900, the year after annexation, most of which involve imposing tariffs on goods that are being shipped and bars on shipping certain goods. So these are all kind of people and items moving across borders. And one of them involves someone who tries to import into New York. And so they've taken some oranges, I believe, from Puerto Rico. They've brought them to New York. They're forced to pay this very small tariff. And they sue and say, I shouldn't have to pay this tariff. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. The tariff is not uniform with what the rest of the United States pays. The head of the customs house, a guy named Bidwell, should give me back the handful of dollars I paid in tariffs. And so the court decides this case in what's known as Downs versus Bidwell in 1901. And what they hold is that the tariff is constitutional. So it is okay to impose the tariff. That seems to mean that at least for purposes of this one part of the Constitution, Puerto Rico is not part of the United States. But no opinion in the case gets 5 votes. And as you probably know, it takes 5 votes to make law in the Supreme Court. So beyond the very judgment that the tariff is okay, no other reasoning is made into law. The most influential part of the decision is a concurrence that gets 3 or 4 votes by Justice Edward Douglas White. And his view is we need to make up a new constitutional theory to cover this case. That constitutional theory is called the territorial non-incorporation doctrine. And the idea is that the United States isn't just made up of states and territories, but territories are subdivided. There's incorporated territories and unincorporated territories. Incorporated territories are everything that happened before 1899, so New Mexico, Arizona, and unincorporated territories is everything that happened beginning in 1899. So that would be Puerto Rico, Philippines, Guam, American Samoa. And the idea is that these places would be neither foreign nor domestic. So they wouldn't be they're not foreign in the sense that other countries should keep their noses out, but they're not domestic in the sense that you don't get full constitutional rights there. This was ambiguous in 2 ways. So one way was he never said what the rights were that you wouldn't get in these territories. He didn't provide any real way to figure out what the rights were, and he didn't say whether or not people in the territories got citizenship. The other way it was ambiguous is he didn't have 5 votes yet, so it wasn't even clear that this would eventually be the doctrine that would be settled on. But at this stage, all the federal branches had spoken on the status of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, and none had really settled the matter of what Puerto Rico was or who Puerto Ricans were. And this is where the protagonists in my book step onto the stage. So this is Federico de Gato y Gonzalez. He is a lawyer, a legislator, a political party leader, a poet, a novelist, a gentleman, and an all-around liberal reformer intellectual. He had been prominent prior to U.S. annexation of Puerto Rico. He had long fought for rights and citizenship and self-government under Spanish rule, and he now seeks the same thing for Puerto Rico under U.S. rule. His island votes him the resident commissioner to Washington, which means he goes there and registers with the State Department and then has an entirely unclear role. But what he decides he's going to do is try to win his people's citizenship. He thinks if I can convince Americans that the Constitution gives us citizenship, that'll open the floodgates, rights, and relatively rapid statehood will follow. And so his approach is just to go anywhere in the federal government he can and demand citizenship. So this is one of my favorites. He goes to the Supreme Court. If you're a lawyer and you want to be a member of the Supreme Court bar, according to the rules of the court, you have to be a citizen. So he doesn't tell a current member of the Supreme Court bar this. He just goes and asks a current member to recommend him. And the justices say, oh, you're this new resident commissioner. Welcome to Washington. Sure, you can be on the bar. And so they put his name here on the Supreme Court bar roll, and now he's a member. And then he goes and gives a press conference and says, we're citizens. The Supreme Court said so. And it turns out there's like law professors who are all on board with this, right? We're an excitable lot. And there's newspaper headlines. And so some people think that this means the Supreme Court's going to say Puerto Ricans are citizens. Instead, the Supreme Court basically ignores it. But he has a bunch of other ways that he tries to run these cases too. So he goes to the civil service and he says, look, we have quotas for all American states and territories. Puerto Rico should get a quota, and the civil service agrees. And so he thinks, see, we're a traditional territory. He finds a friend of his who's an artist in France, and he has this friend paint something and send it to him. And then he says, I shouldn't have to pay a tariff on that painting because there's an exemption for the import tariffs for the works of American artists. And this guy's an American artist, and the people who are importing agree. although they note that that doesn't mean he's necessarily a citizen, and they point to American Indians. And this is essentially what constantly happens to him, is he comes up with clever ideas, and administrators find ways to duck. But as he's doing this, he's laying out a racial argument. And so he shows up and writes back to his friends in Puerto Rico, things are a lot worse than we thought. They really have a low view of us as a race. They have this mistaken impression that we're not white. And it's true. There are editorial cartoonists caricaturing Puerto Ricans as akin to Africans and savages, recent immigrants from Europe, children and women. And so what Degateau does is he tries to present himself as an exemplar of kind of white masculinity from Puerto Rico. And so he's going all over. He's going to legislative officials and executives and people in the agencies and reporters and academics. And he's saying, look at me, I'm a gentleman. I speak a bunch of languages fluently, and I'm really funny and charming. He gets written up for his good look and magnetic personality. And then he also says, and I'm representative of Puerto Rico. And he goes around telling this history, this stylized history of Puerto Rico playing kind of a viral, masculine, virtuous role in the historical pursuit of liberty. As I mentioned, the usual thing that happens when he does all of this is that the federal government bends but doesn't break. So this passport is a nice example. He sought a passport for himself. There was a law that said only U.S. citizens could get passports. It appears this is going to be a Supreme Court test case. Instead, now President Theodore Roosevelt, who had ascended to the White House after McKinley was assassinated, causes Congress to enact a law creating an exception for people in the islands that allows them to get a passport too. And so instead of settling the citizenship question, Degateau manages to get Puerto Ricans passports, but you'll see that they just dodge the question of whether they're U.S. citizens by using this odd language instead. This is really frustrating for Degateau. He's run for office on the claim that he's going to settle the citizenship question. And he finally gets a break when a young woman named Isabelle Gonzalez decides to move to New York. It's 1902, she's not yet 21, and she's facing financial hardship in San Juan. So she decides she's going to go and try to meet her uncle Domingo Collazo, who lives in Manhattan, and her brother Luis, who is working on Staten Island. And Collazo is a good person to meet because he kind of knows the New York scene and is well established. He had left Puerto Rico for New York much earlier in the 1880s as a young printer, which meant that he had a trade which was put him in a relatively high class within Puerto Rico. In New York, he had joined the Cuban Revolutionary Movement, helped co-found this newspaper in support of it. And when insurrection broke out in Cuba and it became clear the United States would invade Puerto Rico, he had signed up to be part of a Puerto Rico commission. And he had joined U.S. troops in the invasion of Puerto Rico, acting as a guide and an interpreter. And he had hoped that this would mean Puerto Rico would be treated like other territories. It would be on the road to statehood, people would be citizens. He was quickly disillusioned, and so he returned shortly after the invasion and resettled in New York, and had become a fairly well-connected journalist as well as translator by this time. And so Collazo goes to Ellis Island to meet his niece, Isabelle Gonzalez, who is supposed to arrive. And the rules are most people get through, but they want to make sure you're not going to be what was called a public charge. So it's important that Collazo go because he can say, I will take her into my household and I make money and I will guarantee her. So I'll be the head of household that will cover over this single woman. And it turns out that immigration officials were basically dubious of this. So Isabelle Gonzalez already had a child back in Puerto Rico that she left behind, and she showed up 8 months pregnant with $11, which was less than the amount they liked to see at the time. And they just thought, this isn't your daughter, it's your niece. Are you really going to support her? We're not convinced. What we'd really like you to do is show up with someone who's willing to marry her or who has married her. So the next day, Gonzalez's brother, Luis, shows up, and he has another tack. So he says, all right, I'm going to level with you. My sister Isabelle, she was a victim of what he would have known as rapto, which is a Spanish crime that's similar to seduction or breach of promise to marry. And the way it worked under Spanish law is that if a man was able to have sex with a woman upon promise of marriage and the woman had been a virgin, then a court would put the man to a choice. You would be criminally liable, that could be a big fine or even time in prison, or you could marry the woman. And if you married the woman, it would restore her honor and her position, and it would relieve the man of criminal liability. So it could be an effective remedy, especially for people who had the social standing to get courts to do what they wanted. And so what he says is, look, we're going to solve this problem. I get it, my sister's pregnant. We found the guy. And as soon as I have my sister with me, we are going to have them married. I have also gone to the authorities and told them, my aunt has made arrangements and is sure of making a reconciliation and will have them married. And of course, immigration officials, right, this idea that you could go to the authorities and force a marriage, they're just incredulous. And so they deny Isabelle Gonzalez entry. And at this stage, Gonzalez swings into action. He brings an action for habeas corpus. That's a writ that says produce the body and justify the detention. So now we're in court, which is, right, we're back on our path to the Supreme Court. And the case kind of bubbles through the lower courts, and then it ends up in an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court on the question of whether or not Isabelle Gonzalez could enter the country. Now, at this stage, probably the best constitutional lawyer on the question of empire jumps into the case as Isabelle Gonzalez's lawyer. He basically sees this as a really good vehicle for being able to try to settle the question of whether Puerto Ricans are citizens. And the question presented is, are Puerto Ricans aliens subject to U.S. immigration laws? Are they citizens free to enter the mainland, or are they something in between? And it turns out there are precedents for something in between alien and citizen. The best one is Dred Scott. You'll recall that's the case that had held that free African Americans weren't citizens. It's the case the 14th Amendment overruled. And the idea here is, well, if free African Americans hadn't been citizens, they certainly weren't aliens, so they must have been Americans who were not citizens of some sort. And Gonzalez's lawyer loves to cite this because then he can say, but such views have been repudiated by the American people in the Civil War, by 3 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, by this course, and by 40 years of advancing civilization. So the idea is, yeah, the category exists, but you don't really want to go there. It didn't turn out for the Dred Scott Court justices. You don't want to repeat that mistake. So the second precedent was a post-Civil War case called Elk v. Wilkins. And you'll recall, if you were born into an Indian tribe, owing primary allegiance to that tribe, then you were not one of the people who got citizenship under the 14th Amendment. And that's because the 14th Amendment requires birth in the United States, but also birth subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And so the question, the way that comes out is, if your primary allegiance is to a tribe, you're thought not to be subject to U.S. jurisdiction. This case involved what happens if you're born into tribal allegiance, but later you renounce your tribe. You give up that allegiance. You expatriate yourself from the tribe. And the Supreme Court says, doesn't matter. When you were born, you weren't subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, so you weren't born a citizen, and renouncing your other citizenship, your tribal citizenship, doesn't free you from the requirement that you have to go through the naturalization process. And so this right was designed to suggest, well, if you lose your tribal relations and you're still not a citizen, here's another category that is of non-citizen American or non-citizen national. And the idea here is Congress closed this loophole pretty quickly, so Gonzalez's lawyer says, sure, this one's possible too, but as soon as it happened, we all realized it was silly and a mistake and fixed it. So again, you don't want to go this way. So you might imagine the lawyers in the case disagreed. So the government thought, in fact, we really do need to say that Puerto Ricans aren't citizens because the immigration laws are about protecting the country from racial contagions. There's all of these lesser races that are out there. The immigration laws give us a way to screen them. And if you hold that Puerto Ricans are citizens, Filipinos presumably would be citizens, and that would defeat the purpose of the immigration laws. And then De Gateau, well, then I guess I should say, Gonzalez's lawyer says, not only do you not want to make the mistake of Dred Scott and Elk v. Wilkins, but you should think of them as models. So now free African Americans are citizens, and American Indians, many of them are citizens. And do they have rights? No, they do not. You can give Puerto Rican citizenship and still treat them really crummy. So you shouldn't be afraid of citizenship. And Federico de Gateau has a different argument, right? His is, I'm not John Elk, I'm not Dred Scott, I'm just like you, justices. I'm even a member of your bar. You should give us citizenship, and you should treat us like white men and give us the full panoply of rights, the full belonging. So in early 1904, the Supreme Court reaches its decision. And it unanimously holds that Puerto Ricans are not aliens. And so they are allowed to travel stateside because the immigration laws apply only to aliens and so not to them. The court simply did not reach the citizenship decision, the citizenship question, but that silence was understood by everyone to mean the court was at least contemplating the notion of a non-citizen American or a non-citizen national. Excuse me. And so at this stage, we see vagueness. The vagueness we saw in 1901 in Downs v. Bidwell continues, and it's proving useful to empire. So the court is not quite saying we're giving up on the Constitution, but it's green-lighting a whole series of imperial practices, and then it's going back to the political branches and the agencies to figure out, well, do we have enough discretion to get done what we want, or do we want to push the court, right, to go a little bit further? So for De Gateau, this decision was politically fatal. He had basically banked on being able to win citizenship, and he had, after this, it's clear the court's not going to say Puerto Ricans are citizens, so his entire platform is collapsing around him. The United States, while he was running around trying to get citizenship, had consolidated his colonial regime in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. So in some ways, right, it's unclear what he could have done to prevent that, but he hadn't done it. And so he lost re-election and he withdrew from public life. But it's worth noting that he was dealt a bad hand and he did win some gains. So whenever he would try to get citizenship, the agency's move would be to not give him citizenship, but often to give him the concrete thing he wanted, the passport, the civil service quota. And so as a result, Puerto Ricans ended up with passports and civil service quotas. They had non-alien status, federal jobs, access to the mainland, and he even won the right to speak on the floor in Congress. Now, Gonzalez wasn't done at this stage. She joined with her uncle Domingo Collazo to seize a public voice and started publishing letters in leading New York newspapers. She drew on popular U.S. analogies between annexation and elopement. So again, right, Puerto Rico is female. Puerto Rico is not going to be the father or the husband. But the elopement metaphor is one of Puerto Rico voluntarily leaving Spain to come to the United States. And she is going to rework this to say, that was a nice way to start, but then I became, and Puerto Rico became the victim of a political rapto, or seduction. U.S. officials had promised Puerto Ricans liberation in return for their allegiance. But then they had not provided citizenship, self-government, or rights. And in fact, she said, look, I was more or less subject to criminal punishment. I was held and confined and then paroled for, and the reason that happened wasn't because I did something wrong, it's because you, the United States, betrayed me. You fell down on your promise. So as Gonzalez puts it, I was subject to detention at Ellis Island for the crime of being an alien. And I'll just take a moment to pause and say, the last paragraph I just shared with you, I really love. If you were to read the case record, Gonzalez appears as this poor mother. She has multiple out-of-wedlock children. Her relatives come and just lie up and down. And it was a total surprise to me that she had this other life, that she was a sophisticated, cross-cultural, bilingual, legal political analyst who was able to get herself in the public sphere. And it got me digging into her life a lot, and I kind of discovered some stuff about her. So in Degatau's personal papers, I found this letter by her, and it demonstrated that she's among the few Puerto Ricans who could write fluently in the period. She actually has very good handwriting, good spelling and grammar, and she knows how to here she's making a case that Degatau ought to help her place her younger sister in a private school. And so she's kind of expertly playing on norms of kind of masculinity and Degatau's sense that he's a gentleman who helps uplift people who are less than him. So it's actually pretty sophisticated attempt at gaining charity and manipulating Degatau. And then as I dug, I found that I could use text searches and sort of find other letters by her. And she published 24 letters, or, give or take, across 2 decades in a whole variety of New York newspapers. And then one of these hits brought me to a letter where Collazo explained how this worked. And someone had basically said, Domingo Collazo, you are a liar. You write letters in your niece's name, and then you get them published by claiming to be her, but it's not her, it's you, and you're a bad person. And so then Collazo writes to other groups he's worked with, and it comes out that what's happened is he and Gonzalez are working together. So that when these letters get published, the people publishing them seem to know that they're from both of them and that Gonzalez is lending her name, but also drawing on her uncle's expertise as a journalist and really like a rhetorical master, especially in English. So then I got poking around in directories and, marriage records and the such, and it turns out Isabelle Gonzalez was married at the time her case was pending before the Supreme Court. So the way her case worked is She was excluded essentially for not having a husband, which made them think she was likely to be a public charge and not eligible for entry. Almost immediately after she's out on parole, she in fact marries someone who, and the marriage lasts for half a dozen years. And that should have settled the case. She should have then been allowed to enter, but she hides the fact that she's married from the court so that the case can continue forward on the citizenship ground. So then, out of nowhere, Isabelle Gonzalez's great-granddaughter, Belinda Torres Mary, emails me and says, "Hey, I read your article. That's my great-grandmother." And it turns out that Belinda is a really good genealogist and been studying her family for a long time. So this kind of opens things up. We trade a lot of documents. And she tells me two things that strike me as highly unlikely. So one is, she says, Isabelle was married as a teenager, which means she was married before she came to the United States. But I have her arriving on Ellis Island with no husband, right, and actually getting married after that. So that doesn't seem very likely. And then she says, also, Isabelle, the person she married as a teenager was a gentleman. And I don't know if you've run into this, but it seems to me like everybody I know claims they have a duke somewhere in their family tree. And so I was like, yeah, I've heard that one before, but I don't think so. And then at some point, she lit on the idea that maybe she reminded me that the story wasn't that the family said she had a gentleman for a husband. It was that they would say she had a caballero, which is the Spanish word for gentleman. So we started searching for that, and it turned out she had indeed been married to a Mr. Caballero. And he had died young from tuberculosis, which is why she had to go to the United States. She'd never had a child out of wedlock, right, which I had always thought she'd had multiple. It turned out she always, right, the marriages all lined up and it covered everything. And so what you have is a woman who carefully hewed to the norms of family respectability. She was a very serious Catholic, but then she publicly portrayed herself as something quite different in order to pursue legal and political goals. And that adds a lot of poignancy to her calling out the United States for its metaphorical sexual immorality, right? This is a game she's been playing a long time, and to some sacrifice. Okay, so back to the narrative. So Collazo, at this stage, uses his involvement in the case to start commenting a lot in Puerto Rican newspapers. And slowly, he completes his transition from being a printer to being a full-time journalist. He gets a regular column in the most popular newspaper on the island. And then he seeks, through that column, to broker a political deal between the leading political party on the island and the mainland Democratic Party. And it's worth noting, he chooses the Democrats because he's desperate. So he started out with the Republicans, right? They're the party, right? Domingo Collazo was part of a racially egalitarian Cuban revolutionary movement. The Republicans are the party of Lincoln. But then when he invaded the island with them, they didn't give his people rights. They didn't give them citizenship. It's a Republican commissioner of immigration who tries to deport his niece. It's the Republican attorney general that argues against them at the Supreme Court. So he's done with the Republicans and figures any port in a storm. The problem is Democrats are not very reliable allies. So they didn't really win any national elections, very few up until this point. And as they gained more and more control over the South, they had less to fear from the federal government, which meant their white supremacy wasn't being counterbalanced with their fear of federal power. And that's bad in the colonies because white supremacy pushes towards colonialism. And Collazo basically just ignored this because it didn't work for his agenda. And he ends up going in big for the Democrats. So Democrats are making basically just hazy promises of self-government to the colonies. They're just these gestures that are designed to kind of push for states' rights. But Collazo, who's disillusioned and has few options, is enticed. And so he continually declares that Democrats will elevate their anti-imperialism over their racism against Puerto Ricans if they take power. And his argument was the Democrats are going to redeem Puerto Rico from federal tyranny the same way that they redeemed Alabama from Reconstruction rule. At this stage, we'll introduce the book's final protagonist, Santiago Iglesias y Pantin. He was born in Spain, in Europe, but had come to Puerto Rico as a young man and had quickly moved up within the labor movement there. It had been relatively small. He'd done a lot to grow it and organize it. And he shared Collazo's faith that federal power could be a force for good. He was now in his mid-30s, pretty clearly the head of organized labor on the island, and his rise to power had a lot to do with his having become a good friend with Samuel Gompers. Now, as some of you may know, Samuel Gompers was the president of the American Federation of Labor. That was the largest and most powerful labor organization in the United States at the time. It was also an organization known for being unfriendly to African Americans, unfriendly to Chinese immigrants, in favor of limits on labor migration, and unfriendly to unskilled workers, right? It was a trade union, so they liked to organize people who had skills around the particular jobs that they did. And so you wouldn't think that Gompers and Iglesias would make a good match because their unions were so different. In Puerto Rico, the large majority of people worked in the fields. They were agricultural workers. Puerto Rico had a racially mixed population, and in sort of popular imagination, it was growing increasingly darker. It was being racialized over time. And the story here is one of these moments where just an idiosyncratic link made it all go. So Gompers had started out in the cigar trade in the 19th century. There were lots of Puerto Ricans and Cubans in that trade who were very active in the labor movement. So he came in with this view that Puerto Ricans might actually be good people to align with. And then Iglesias was born in Spain. Gompers was born in England. So Iglesias is a European immigrant. And Iglesias and Gompers are also just very simpatico. They hit it off right from the start. And Iglesias is extremely skilled at manipulating the race line, at kind of emphasizing there are a few skilled laborers in Puerto Rico. There are a bunch of white people in Puerto Rico. So he's sort of acting as a broker between, or an intermediary between, the multiracial Puerto Rican organized labor movement and the largely white American Federation of Labor. It's really good to have the AFL as an ally because everybody else seems to be against organized labor in Puerto Rico. Both political parties on the island are dominated by elites who don't think much of workers. The economy is increasingly dominated by mainland capital, which is really not interested in workers. And the sugar industry in particular is becoming the major industry of the island. It turns out the American Federation of Labor alone, though, isn't enough. So in 1906, there's a big strike in the sugar fields, and it gets crushed. And the American Federation of Labor can't do anything to help on its own. So Iglesias starts trying to court federal officials as a second ally. And the basic notion here is to try to claim Americanness. So he tells federal officials, the local politicians are just self-interested, corrupt jerks who are anti-American, but we, the workers, we are the true patriots. We love America. And what we want is what he called a dependent form of citizenship. We don't want to have strikes. What we want is the federal government to come help us, teach us, uplift us, the workers. And this played into federal officials' sense of themselves, and it turned out that pretty quickly, Iglesias was good friends with a bunch of colonial administrators. So now we're going to come to disillusionment. Woodrow Wilson became the second Democrat since the Civil War to be elected president in 1912, and both Collazo and Iglesias had reasons to be hopeful. So for Iglesias, he thought the AFL backed Wilson. Wilson seems friendly to organized labor. Maybe Wilson will have the back of organized workers in Puerto Rico too. For Collazo, this was the moment he'd been waiting for, the arrival of Democrats in power. He hoped that Democrats would say imperialism reenacted Reconstruction. Puerto Rico merited the same redemption from home rule that the former Confederacy had secured. And, they're both going to be disappointed. So by 1913, Reconstruction was clearly vanquished. The Supreme Court had green-lighted Jim Crow and disfranchisement. White supremacists had instituted both throughout the U.S. South. Democrats had a seemingly impregnable hold on the former Southern Confederacy. They had little to fear from the federal government, and so they were essentially ready to unite with Republicans in favor of colonialism and in favor of white supremacy. And this turned out to be bad news for Collazo and for Iglesias. Puerto Rico had a racially mixed population, and Wilson was from a party of racists. Colonial officials measured their success in terms of mainland investment to a large degree. So they had little appetite for industrial unrest, which was really the only way in the long run Puerto Rican workers were going to get higher wages. President Wilson favored colonial rule of Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And so then World War I hits, and sugar prices spike during wartime, but sugar wages don't, and workers get impatient, and they go on strike. Over the next few years, they go on strike by the tens of thousands. And everybody's against this. I mean, the American Federation of Labor and Iglesias are all for it, but federal officials think it's a bad idea, employees don't like it, colonial officials don't like it, the political parties on the island don't like it. And basically what they do is they rain down violence and repression, so people get arrested in mass arrests, people are shot, people die. And the Wilson administration is unwilling to either press employers to raise wages or to ensure that workers are protected. And so the strike pretty quickly collapses each year. And Iglesias thinks, I need a new ally. So he scours the federal government and he comes up with the Commission on Industrial Relations. This is created by Congress to investigate labor relations in the United States, and Iglesias pulls together just tons of telegrams and affidavits and documents to show that rights of workers had been violated. And he presented them to the commission, which wrote this very lengthy report and included a small bit on Puerto Rico that said, it's true, Puerto Ricans live in incredible squalor and poverty, and their rights are violated on a regular basis when they try to go on strike. And this is, it doesn't get workers higher wages, but it's a big win for Iglesias because it shows that he can turn one part of the federal government against another, and it convinces him that dependent citizenship is not the way to go, that what he wants is a citizenship that he can wield as a sword, that he can use to claim rights before different federal agencies. Now, as you might imagine, the Wilson administration is not anxious to give Puerto Ricans rights-rich citizenship, but they also realize withholding citizenship is pretty unpalatable. It struck many lawmakers as simply un-American not to give people born in the United States citizenship. Puerto Ricans wanted citizenship. Latin American countries looked at Puerto Rico and thought, can't trust the U.S., see how they treat Puerto Rico. And World War I put the United States in the position of trying to say, we're the country in favor of democracy, and so having colonies without citizens looked bad. It was Felix Frankfurter who came up with a solution. He said, look, he basically did the root move. If you look at all the things that have happened recently involving all these different communities, you can see that Congress can do whatever it wants. It can grant citizenship and withhold rights and withhold statehood or mix it up however it wants, and the Supreme Court is going to be just fine with that. And so Collazo says citizenship has become, quote, a gold brick, something that looks pretty but has no value. And Congress thought, great. So in 1916, Congress was set to give citizenship to Puerto Ricans without granting them full constitutional rights, without granting them much more self-government, without any promise of statehood, and planning to disfranchise most Puerto Ricans from voting, even in local elections. Iglesias managed, with Gompers' help, to roll back the part of this that would disfranchise Puerto Ricans, and so in 1917, Puerto Ricans became citizens. They continued to be able to vote in their local elections, but that didn't matter much because they were essentially still under colonial rule. It's tempting to think that this means citizenship wasn't important, but in the century since collective naturalization, it has become clear that citizenship mattered. So Iglesias, during the latter part of World War I, was able to use Puerto Rican citizenship to get labor disputes in Puerto Rico before new federal agencies that were designed to mediate between labor and industry to keep wartime production constant. And that gained Puerto Ricans protection and led to some of the biggest strikes in the island's history and some real gains. In New York, Domingo Collazo realized, hey, wait, if Puerto Ricans are citizens, they can now vote. And so he transformed himself into a Democratic machine party boss. And he brought Puerto Ricans down to the government offices, had them register to vote, and then voted them for different candidates and gained some power for his community and himself. And citizenship also distinguished Puerto Ricans from Filipinos. So Puerto Ricans have the enduring freedom to migrate to the United States because they are citizens. And Filipinos were, right, the Philippines became independent, and because they weren't citizens, it was easier to denationalize them and make them Filipino, right, citizens of the Philippines and not of the United States. By contrast, more U.S. citizens of Puerto Rican descent now live on the mainland than live in the island. Back on the island, however, Puerto Rico does remain an unincorporated territory. So self-government and constitutional rights are tenuous. The insular cases remain binding precedent, and harms to Puerto Ricans from racism and associations with foreignness continue and may even be more glaring in this moment. We also have this rare and somewhat shocking spectacle of case law that was born of racism being untouched by time 120 years later. And so that I think of as one of the lessons in the perils of empire that we've learned over this last century and score of years. And it's led to a lot of suffering in Puerto Rico, and suffering that doesn't seem like it's over yet. And I'll say, so that's the sort of downer note the book ends on. What I'm going to do now, though, is pivot a little to think, what does this help us? How does this help us think about what's going on in the Supreme Court or what might happen? So what I'll start with is I laid out a vision of the Reconstruction Constitution at the beginning as being one of all Americans are citizens, all places become states, and everywhere U.S. sovereignty runs, so do full constitutional rights. And one question we might have is that vision recoverable or is it lost, right? The law changes over time, and sometimes things that happened in the past are just gone. And I think there's some possibility of recovery here. So to start, in In Downs versus Bidwell, Justice White said, you will get fewer rights in these unincorporated territories, but I won't tell you what rights you won't get. And since then we've learned it used to be you didn't get jury rights, though it now seems like you may be required to. There was this thing about tariffs, right? But it turns out free trade, right, gets put into place anyway. And they really haven't come up with any other rights that you don't get. So were the court to want to get rid of the distinction between incorporated and unincorporated, it wouldn't have to extend new rights to anyone. So it's a low-cost move if anyone was interested in getting back there. The second question is, should places that are permanently part of the United States be required to eventually become states? And here, the answer hasn't changed much. So it was something you would say in the past, that every territory must become a state, but the court always thought it was up to the political branches to enforce that. So the court, were it to go back to its old way, it could begin saying again, it is true that every place should eventually become a state, but we're not going to intervene, right? That's how we understand the Constitution, but political branches, that's up to you. And so that old understanding is still low stakes and available. Finally, there's this question of, should you get citizenship if you're born in one of the territories? And that question is largely moot at this point because Congress has by statute extended birthright citizenship to every U.S. territory except American Samoa. So in American Samoa, if you are born there, you are a U.S. national by birth, but not necessarily a citizen. And the reason for that is that American Samoans, democratically elected representatives, have said they don't want birthright citizenship. And so this makes it a complicated issue. To start, the rule under the 14th Amendment that anyone born in the U.S. gets citizenship was put in place in order to prevent states from withholding citizenship from African Americans. So it's not obvious as a first principle that the government should be able to decide for each person whether or not they have access to birthright citizenship. One reading of the 14th Amendment is that it's designed precisely to prevent the government from doing that. The other complexity, I guess, is that American Samoans seem a little bit like American Indians in the sense that it's a somewhat autonomous community that the United States wants to respect its culture as well as its free political choices. And this has led, let me see if I have it. Yes. So this has led some judges to say you may be born in the United States if you're born in American Samoa, but you're not born subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And the idea is American Samoa is akin to an American Indian tribe. The problem with this is that American Samoans, indigenous American Samoans, have never been recognized as a tribe. And the analogy falls apart because if you're not an American Indian and you're born on an Indian reservation, you get the birthright citizenship, right? It's that your allegiance runs to the tribe that strips you of it, not because you're born in a particular place. So were that exception to sort of gain traction, or that reasoning to gain traction, it would really require rethinking American Indian law to a pretty substantial degree. The other argument you see is they're not born in the United States because Downs versus Bidwell indicated that these are places that are not fully domestic, and if you count noses, it seems like there were 5 justices who thought birth in unincorporated territories shouldn't bring citizenship, even though they couldn't all agree on one opinion. The problem is twofold. One, Downs versus Bidwell is rooted in really racist reasoning. So to the extent that doctrine remains valid, it's because subsequent cases have picked up parts of it and reiterated and ratified them. To look only to that as a source is problematic. But worse, Gonzalez versus Williams expressly reserved the question whether or not Puerto Ricans and Filipinos were U.S. citizens. And that case came later in time and was a unanimous case. And so the court itself clearly thought that case hadn't been settled yet. So, as you might not be surprised to learn, I write amicus briefs in cases involving American Samoans where I try to tell the court some of this history. And the basic point that I say in those is, at least until the insular cases, United States was understood to mean the extent of U.S. sovereignty, and subject to the jurisdiction was meant to be a carve-out so that American Indians could be excluded from citizenship, and so that ambassadors' children wouldn't be citizens. So that if you were an ambassador, you were sort of formally subject to a foreign jurisdiction, and you wouldn't have double nationality when your kids were born. Okay, so that's one really concrete application. Let's try now doing a couple other issues that are a little further afield. So what about, so these are just the cases that are, for the American Samoan cases. The most recent is this one. These are two of the plaintiffs, and their counsel is this guy, Neil Weir. So it's a reminder there's real people who are pushing these, and you have to drum them up each time. Okay. What about the detention cases? So you may recall between 2004 and 2008, there was this whole string of cases where the Supreme Court seemed to be reining in the executive branch and eventually Congress in terms of what was going on in Guantanamo Bay. And in Hamdi, there was this ruling you need to have a little bit of process if you're going to declare someone an enemy combatant. Hamdan said, look, the Geneva Conventions apply, at least under the existing statutory framework. And then Boumediene said, and even if Congress comes in and says, you have a broader set of powers, Mr. President, we're still going to say we, the courts, need to be able to determine if detentions are lawful, and there's a bunch of things you need to do to make the trials fair to help us make that determination. And Boumediene was an opinion by my former boss, Justice Kennedy, and it was somewhat unclear at the end of the opinion when it applied and what exact rights you needed to get. And then since 2008, there's been silence. And so when I look at this, I think this looks a lot like the insular cases. There were a flurry of early activity. The early activity was, it seemed respectful of the Constitution, at least in a symbolic way, but it always let the government more or less do what it wanted. And then the court largely went silent for a while, and then about 2 decades later, the court said, well, now we're going to say there really is this territorial non-incorporation doctrine. There really are less rights for people in these places. And by that point, almost everyone on the court had changed over. And so nobody has gotten out of Guantanamo by court order yet. And if we were to think of this as similar, we would expect that silence will continue for a while, and then at some point there'll be enough new people on the court who are accustomed enough to Guantanamo kind of being the status quo that they'll start saying, it turns out like that's okay, at least in some ways. And I think the only way that's likely to be avoided is if Guantanamo Bay is closed down before you would get such a case. The other way it could be avoided is it turns out historical analogies aren't perfect, so it's possible, right, that this would fall apart, but the insular cases doesn't give me much optimism that the court is, having not swooped in to release people yet, that it's planning to do that anytime in the foreseeable future. This also helps me think a little bit about the travel ban. So when the Trump administration first released a travel ban, it was badly constructed, and it was hurried. People protested in huge numbers. Administrators weren't sure how to implement it. It seemed to bar people who probably had statutory or constitutional rights to enter. It appeared to have religious discrimination on behalf of Christians, which the president more or less said expressly. And then what you saw was something that was familiar to me. Different parts of the government engaging in a kind of signaling campaign. And so lower courts started joining it, but the Supreme Court holds off on deciding. Trump goes through 2 iterations. So first he issues Travel Ban 2.0, where he gets rid of the Christians and gets rid of barring green card holders and dual citizens. And then Travel Ban 3.0, where he's now brought in lots of people throughout the government to make the decision. He's framed the executive order in terms of kind of rational processes. We did a study, the study produced this is why we came to it. He's differentiating countries according to how the study came out. He's got a waiver program. And that's what the Supreme Court upholds. And my sense is that the Supreme Court probably thinks this was a great success because it had, without ever saying the president had done something unconstitutional, it had managed to guide the other branches to a space where the president was at least satisfied that he had the ban he wanted, or he had a ban he could live with, and the most glaring constitutional problems had just been removed. And so there's now this case about emergency funding for the building a border wall, and one view is, well, after the travel ban, they're surely going to let him do that too. And another view is maybe there'll be a similar delicate dance that will kind of bring things in for a somewhat softer landing. And then I think a little bit about, what does this tell me about the fact that the personnel on the court are changing, that we just have a more conservative court? And I guess I have 2 thoughts. I used to think democracy always wins out. So if the court gets too far left or right, eventually elections bring it back into line and the bad decisions get overturned. The insular cases, though, were rooted in racism. They've never had any academic defenders. They've never made much sense. Very few judges have been excited about them. And yet 120 years later, they're still humming along, determining outcomes. In some ways, they've been reinvigorated. And what that tells me is that courts, like, if your view is, I'm sad that we have a conservative court, you shouldn't expect democracy necessarily to save you, that courts do things that are enduring. On the other hand, I study people that were trying to get citizenship and migration rights and whatnot from a conservative court, and they had their successes. So Isabelle Gonzalez was a sympathetic litigant. She positioned herself very well. She was extremely determined. And that makes me think that people engaging with constitutional law and trying to shift it can actually matter. And her lawyer, Frederick Couder, was, right, I mean, he's brilliant, but he also found the fissures where he could try to get, right, marginal gains, and he often won for his clients. He never entirely overturned the doctrines, but he was able to have his successes. And this reminds me, I have a neighbor who works for the ACLU, and the day Kavanaugh was confirmed, I asked him sort of, how's it going? And he said, well, you know, I'm just getting used to losing every case forever. And as he's thought more about it, I think he's realized, right, that's not how it's going to go, that the law is going to shift in ways he doesn't like, but that talented lawyers with dedicated litigants are able to move things sometimes, and that it's important that that's true because the justices tend to exist on a kind of plane of theory or abstraction, and the fact that they have to grapple with smart, unexpected arguments and people in weird, compelling circumstances has a way of grounding them and preventing the theory from them getting too beholden to the theory. So I think I will stop there, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and your thoughts. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll use this mic.
Sure.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Erman. Wasn't that exciting? Wasn't that interesting? Yeah, did a great job. We're going to have a time now for questions and answers. People are coming around with I know what happened just there, but people are coming around with mics. And in just a second, let me see, Dan. We ask you to use a mic because we do record this. Yeah, I see the hand. Just a second.
How's that?
All right. I'm hearing a mic. Yeah, go ahead. I'm hearing a mic. Go ahead. I hear someone tapping on mic. Go ahead, whoever that is. Oh, there she is. Good. Right up here's that hand. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor. 2 quick observations. Number 1, not everyone born in this country becomes an American citizen. You missed a category. I'm a former staff member of the United Nations, several thousand employees, most of whom have children born in the U.S. who do not become citizens. Secondly, most of us will recall that we do not live in a democracy, we live in a republic. Do you recall pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands? We've never been a democracy. We are a republic. And you could analyze the Constitution from that perspective. Any comments, please?
So I agree that we're a republic. I will say the exception for subject to the jurisdiction, you're right, includes a series of categories, and the ambassadors is an example that I usually use to stand in for the whole, but it also deals with cases where people are born during an invasion, right, and there's some question of what country they should go to. So it's traditionally been used to handle the weird cases of international relations where people are really part of one government but end up in the other. And the American Indians was like the U.S. innovation circa the 14th Amendment. And neither of those cases neatly fits American Samoa. So then the question is whether there should be another innovation to cover that case or not.
Thank you. In the back right over here, I see one. Yeah. go
Yes,
ahead.
I'd like to know, how did Hawaii become a state? After all, the Hawaiian people are not really white. And how did the Eskimo, are they citizens? And I also remember that Puerto Rico was supposed to vote for statehood, and it was turned down. And I never understood why. Could you answer that?
Yeah, so those are great. So Alaska comes into the Union as a territory in 1867, the year before the 14th Amendment is ratified. So it sneaks in before the idea that everybody has to be a citizen has actually become constitutional. And it is thought of as primarily unoccupied, this vast wilderness. And eventually, it's able to come into the Union as a state as part of the deal that brings in Hawaii. And by that stage, there are more people living there. So you would get citizenship if you were born in Alaska, unless you were born owing primary allegiance to a politically recognized tribe. And then in 1924, Congress gets rid of that and says, and even if you're born owing primary allegiance to a federally recognized tribe, you still are also a U.S. citizen. Hawaii comes into the Union during the war with Spain. So it comes in just before Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And the debates over bringing Hawaii in are essentially, do we really want to bring in this place that doesn't seem to be full of white people and make them citizens and eventually a state? And the answer is, well, we really need them during the war, and they're very small, so let's not worry too much about it. And that was going to be the answer for Puerto Rico, too. It was only the Philippines that then caused this really rapid constitutional innovation. And one of the things I find in the book is the innovations happened, you can trace them to the month. So in October of 1898, it's becoming clear the Philippines will come into the United States, and you start seeing the new constitutional theories bubbling, and they have made it into the Supreme Court's opinions by May of 1901. So it's, right, you can see them moving through the agencies and the Academy and Congress, and it's just a very rapid process at the beginning.
Right over here, there's a question. Yeah.
Yes, the Article 6 of the United States Constitution, Section 3, says the senators and representatives before mentioned and members of several state lawmakers and all executive judicial offices, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or allegiance to support the Constitution. But, and this is the key part of what I'm saying, but no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And fairly recently, Harris and Kennedy made, and this was on January the 17th of this year, referring to the qualifications of Attorney General William Barr to be the Attorney General. One of the questions asked was, does your Catholicism disqualify you from office? And also Kennedy and Harris have both made similar statements in questioning their faith as qualifications. How do you respond to that?
Well, I guess my main response would be Barr is Attorney General, so it appears that there was no qualification. It is, I suspect so there's two ways to think about it. One is, I suspect the Supreme Court's going to stay out, that they're going to think there may be a constitutional right to not be questioned in this way or not have this count against you, but that's a constitutional concern we're going to leave to the political branches to honor because it's too messy for us to get involved. I would also suspect that it would be, that there's some room for playing around with what's a qualification for office. So there you could imagine one argument would be anytime a religious belief disqualifies you from office, the Constitution's violated. But you could imagine a religion that had a belief such as, you shall always just steal all the money, right? And that would make it hard to serve in the Department of Treasury. And usually the courts are pretty good at trying to sort these out. So I think what's troubling about the example you gave isn't that it delved into religious beliefs and how they might affect someone doing the job as a theoretical matter, but that it tapped into what we're worried is a kind of anti-Catholicism or an attempt to take what are religious beliefs that really aren't relevant to the job and portray them as though they are. And those are really hard questions of fact, but they are, in other contexts, ones the courts do struggle with. I'm not sure that's super responsive, but one thing law professors like to do is just restate the question and then say it's hard.
Right over here.
Thank you very much for your very interesting comments. My question is, what is the citizenship status of the people living in the U.S. Virgin Islands, like St. Thomas and Croix?
They are U.S. citizens.
Two more questions. We've got one up here at the top. Go ahead.
I don't have all my facts straight on this one, but I was listening to NPR last night, and they said the Supreme Court came down on a case regarding citizenship, which involved, I think, as far as the same-sex marriage, one was a Canadian, and then there was the in vitro, and one of the donors was an Israeli, and do you know anything about that case? And I'm just thinking how complicated things can be in our global, interesting birth sources these days.
Yeah, so I've heard of the case. I haven't read it yet. So I'll just say a couple things based on not much knowledge. So if you're born in the United States, you get citizenship. So these cases tend to be people who are born in another country, and then the question is, are they citizens as a result of being born to American parents? And there's statutes that cover that. And because we're mixing together, I mean, basically this is a question of in vitro fertilization. And so the question becomes, who counts as the parent for purposes of the transmission of citizenship? And that's just a question of statutory interpretation. So it doesn't, when the court settles that, usually the court will be saying, we think this is what Congress intended, but we could be wrong and Congress can fix it. What makes this interesting is, under the surface is the fact that the way gay married couples are going to have kids is often through in vitro fertilization or through alternative means, right? And so there's an underlying question of, if Congress did try to discriminate against, say, in vitro fertilization, would it be running up against a constitutional problem by an equal protection problem in terms of how it's treating people based on sexual orientation?
Right down here, last question.
During the Spanish-American War, we took over 3 major countries: the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico. And we handled all 3 differently. Cuba had their independence right away. Philippines had a 50-year period and we kept our hold of Puerto Rico. Why?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So Cuba there's a couple reasons we didn't annex Cuba, which it's worth noting is the island the United States most wanted to annex. One is that for various weird political reasons, at the moment the United States went to war with Spain, there was a lot of support for the independistas in Cuba, and so you get an amendment to the war resolution that basically says we're not going to keep Cuba if we invade it. That probably isn't the real reason, though. Probably the real reason is there was a revolution in Cuba, and they had a lot of guns, right? And so holding them forever was looking really dicey, especially because the Philippines had already started an insurrection that was proving quite bloody and to be kind of a black eye for the United States as the United States engaged in unsavory practices. So it's, in a weird way, you could imagine it coming out differently if fighting had erupted in Cuba against U.S. troops before it did in the Philippines, or if there'd never been an eruption of fighting in the Philippines, or if the Cubans in arms had been less intent on being independent. As to why the places that are annexed are treated differently, I think race has a lot to do with why Puerto Rico and the Philippines get treated differently. And then you have Guam and American Samoa, and there I think size is the main difference. So keeping Guam and American Samoa, they're strategic, it's useful to have them, but there's not many people living there, so there isn't the same fear that if you get it wrong, you're going to let millions and millions of people you don't want in, whereas the Philippines, there's all these cartoons about like an invasion of barbaric Filipinos, and so a lot of what's going on is just trying to keep that at bay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erman.
Thank you all. This has been wonderful.